Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Celia Wexler, Vice President of the Society of Professional Journalists, DC Pro chapter. While our official ethics week at SPJ begins April 15th, of this session as an ethics week curtain raiser. Our SPJ ethics code states reporters should search for and report the truth and minimize harm. And we hope this webinar will help you live up to these standards during this fraught election year. Now for some housekeeping. I have a ton of questions for our terrific guests, and I'm sure you do too. We want to hear from you. Please post your questions in the Q&A box, usually found at the bottom of your screen. I will ask of your questions as I can during the program today to make this more of a conversation. Please leave the chat box free. The chat box is where Dan Kubisky, working behind the scenes, will post useful information, including our list of links pertaining to all the issues we discussed today. That list is available for you to download and use. This program is being taped and will be posted on our SPJ DC website and on our YouTube channel. Dan has included the URLs for those links in chat as well. And now I'm honored to introduce our two panelists. Media critic and author Margaret Sullivan, formerly executive editor of the Buffalo News, was public editor at the New York Times and a columnist for the Washington Post. She now writes a column for the Guardian US and is executive director of Columbia Journalism School's Newmark Center for Journalism Ethics and Security. Barton Gellman, a three-time Pulitzer-prize-winner and author, reported for the Washington Post for more than 2 decades, was a staff writer for The Atlantic, and is now a senior advisor to the Brennan Center for Justice. Welcome to you both. I'd like to begin with a fundamental question. What's at stake in the 2024 election?
Well, I'm happy to start off.
Yes.
Well, thanks very much for having us and for having me. I think it's a really important subject. So, we keep hearing this sort of euphemistic talk about democracy on the brink and all of that sort of thing. And it's never really nailed down exactly what we mean by that, or it isn't always nailed down. I think the coming presidential election is a watershed one because whatever you may think of President Biden, it is the case, I believe, that if Donald Trump is elected again for a second term, we're going to see a very different administration than he had the first time around, and one that is going to be focused on, in many ways, taking down some of the restraints and the guardrails that kept him and his administration from doing as much harm to democracy as they could have the first time around. So, it's very awkward for journalists, I think, because we all know this, and yet no one wants to be considered partisan, and no one wants to be considered, in on someone's campaign, which we're not. But I really do think that the choice is an existential one. So that, that's part of what's at stake.
Bart, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I first of all, I want to thank everyone for tuning in when they could be out getting blinded by the sun and trying to watch the eclipse. So we should talk instead about the eclipse of democracy, I guess. We are facing an election in which the basic rules that govern our society, that govern our government, that govern our political system are at stake. That you have a candidate who lost an election and tried to overthrow it, who tried to stay in power despite losing the election, and who denies to this day that he did lose the election, which is just as fundamental a breach of democratic norms and the rules of the game as you could possibly imagine. from a former president. And that same former president has promised to do a great many things that would either break the law or break the fundamental governing norms that we've got in this country. And so the continued existence of a democratic republic as we've understood it to be for the last couple of 100 years is at threat. It is, I don't want to exaggerate it. It could be that one man, even with all his enablers, can't do all the things that he says he wants to do. But showing what he actually wants to do and what the precedents look like overseas for comparable authoritarian figures is a fundamental part of the job of anyone covering this election.
But is only the presidential election crucial, or do the stakes in congressional, state, and other down ballot races?
I think it does apply to down ballot races, because so much of what Trump wants to do requires the tolerance at minimum and the active assistance in many cases of other federal elected officials and also state and local ones, because state and local ones, for example, are the ones who count and certify ballots, or are the ones who are going to have to carry out some of the things that Trump would like to do. Trump has managed to recruit nearly all of a major American political party behind lies about the way the system operates, behind a belief that the federal civil service can't be trusted, that judges can't be trusted, that prosecutors can't be trusted. And he has got all those people on the down ballot who are with him. And so they're definitely a part of this picture.
Margaret, do you have anything to add?
Well, certainly I agree. And while people tend to want to make this all about Donald Trump, there's much more than one person behind this movement. And even if Trump, decided or withdrew for some reason, or, I don't think that the threats to democracy go away, because there's, there are copycats out there. There are people who have come forward to join this movement. And while I do think that Trump is a highly unusual figure because of his ability to, kind of head a cult, essentially, the dangers are far broader.
How well is the media informing voters about what's at stake this year? And you who have come into the webinar a little late, you can post questions in the Q&A box, and we will do our best to answer them during this session. We won't wait till the end to answer your questions. So how well is the media doing? I mean, that's a really kind of general question. But you both have been following the media. You've both been doing exceptional work, raising the alarms. But how is it working for us in terms of, journalism and what's at stake?
I mean, I think that the press learned some things after 2016, but it's sort of like we learned the things that went wrong then, in terms of understanding how the country feels and, sort of thinking that things were more secure than they were. I think we kind of got that, but now there are many sort of new iterations of that, and I don't think we've really caught up with them. I mean, one of the things that I don't think we have figured out is just to communicate how bizarre Trump is in his rallies and in his speeches, because many of us felt like, oh, he got too much free airtime the last time around, and that was a bad thing to do. We shouldn't take his rallies live, etc. And it's kind of a conundrum, because if you don't do that, then you are going to kind of put them in context and make them sound pretty normal, just like any other candidate. And so, I'm beginning to change my mind on this business of whether to actually show his rallies and speeches end to end, or really in some kind of significant chunks of time, because I think people need to see, all the really extreme things he's saying. And then I think another question here is how well, everybody says in these poll respondents that they're so concerned about the economy. Well, the economy is doing very, very well right now. Inflation is low, unemployment is low, growth is strong. Even the cost of a Thanksgiving dinner was lower in 2023 than it was the year before. But somehow everyone wants to talk about how bad the economy is. And, I don't think that we're getting that story across either, although I actually have my doubts about whether that's really what's on people's mind.
Barton, what do you think? Yeah.
I would have to say that, and I've stepped aside from journalism to take this job at the Brennan Center, but I'll speak as I'll include myself among the journalists. I think we're not doing collectively a very good job, and I think one of the reasons is that journalists are not so sure what side they're allowed to be on. Ordinarily, we tell ourselves that we're not allowed to take sides in a campaign or in a political dispute, and that is a bedrock principle that should not be changed. But we are allowed to take sides on some things. We have always taken sides on truth. That truth is a value that we're on the side of. We believe in truth. We're against lies. We believe in not only depicting the world as it is, but in pointing out when others fail to do so. And exactly in the same way, because it's a fundamental principle of our democratic society, is that we're allowed to be on the side of democracy. We're allowed to be on the side of the rule of law. We're allowed to take sides and focus on those things on our own initiative without waiting for someone else to make it news. And there's just not enough focus on Trump's anti-democratic actions and wishes and instincts, and the things that he says and the things that he did. And it was a big improvement over 2015 and 2016 when news media started to become willing to say that he was lying, because we don't like to put ourselves in the heads of a political figure and say we know that he knew this was false. But there's lots of times when you have enough evidence to say someone's lying, and he does lie all the time. In fact, it's possible he has not made any public appearance in the last 5 years without lying. And just as we have to focus on fact-checking him constantly, we have to focus on the fact that he doesn't believe in the fundamental institutions that make up the American constitutional system. And it's also true that he will say truly outrageous things, like he will use words that autocrats have used to justify mass murder. Like he will call political opponents vermin, and that's a one-day story. And I think a good rule of thumb would be for a journalist to ask themselves, if an ordinary politician had said that, if Joe Biden had said that, what would the coverage be like over a period of days and weeks? That story would come back and back and back, but Trump moves on to something else, and all too often reporters move on to something else.
Sarah has a question that fits into this discussion. Is a balance possible between showing an entire Trump speech without context and cleaning up the language to make it more coherent, And if so, how would you suggest doing that? I think that's a real problem. I mean, reporters inherently clean up language to make things more coherent. And yet, what do you do with Trump?
That's been a difficult question, but I think that Sarah's onto something, that it's not a binary choice. It's not like only write a news story that makes him sound like every other politician for the past, 60 years versus, showing full rallies or speeches live end to end. There's definitely something in between, and you can take snippets of things. For one thing, you can put this stuff in context. I do write for The Guardian, so perhaps there's a bias or a conflict of interest in what I'm about to say. But I was very interested over the weekend to see that The Guardian US ran as their lead story for much of one day an analysis piece not by a campaign reporter, but by someone who covers disinformation. And the gist of it was, when you really listen to Trump's speeches, they are bizarre. She used these words: bizarre, incoherent, threatening, vengeful, and then she quoted big chunks of this really strange rambling about Cary Grant and all this stuff. There are some middle grounds here. And we also have to think about, what medium are we in? Are we talking about cable news, or are we talking about essentially text or print story in a newspaper or a newspaper's website? But I think there is some. It's not exactly middle ground. It's not exactly balance. It's sort of a thoughtful approach to getting across the truth, which, as Bart says, we actually are not only allowed to stick up for, we must stick up for it. I mean, and I would add to what he said, perhaps a way for the press to think about this is, we seem to be okay with advocating for press rights, right? We've always been kind of okay with that. And I don't think that, it's so far afield to have our coverage reflect that democracy issues and truth are important in the same way, that we don't need to be so defensive all the time about orienting coverage that way. And it's hard because we're used to sort of taking refuge in this halvesies thing. We treat everybody exactly the same, but these candidates are not the same at all. And so to equalize them is actually very, very misleading.
We've talked about, sort of upholding democracy as something that reporters can and should do. And there's talk about pro-democracy newsrooms and pro-democracy coverage. But does that include defining what it means to live in a democracy? And the reason I ask that is that the 2023 American Values Survey found that 75% of Americans believe the future of democracy is at stake in this election. That's something both Republicans and Democrats agree on. Nearly a quarter of Americans would resort to violence to protect the country. What do those numbers say to you? Because clearly, voters are defining democracy probably not in the same way. So what's our responsibility to explain to people what democracy is?
Well, there are, you're right, very different reasons why Democrats and Republicans say that democracy is at stake. There is a significant minority of rank and file Republicans who believe that the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, so that democracy failed, so that the person who was elected did not take office. And if you really believe that, it is not entirely surprising that a large but smaller fraction of those people believe that violence is justified. Because if the government's illegitimate if the person who is governing as president is the pretender and lost the election, then the whole legitimacy of the project of government is at risk. And it is one of the gravest offenses that Donald Trump has ever committed, that he convinced millions of Americans to believe that the system was illegitimate. It's the most dangerous thing about it. And it's the reason why he's a threat to democracy, because he's prepared to lie and undermine the institutions that democracy depends on. That's courts and it's election officials and so forth. The reason that other people are worried about democracy is because you have a candidate who's not willing to lose an election. I mean, we have two major political parties right now, but only one of them is actually willing to lose an election. The other one is prepared to say that there's only one legitimate outcome in which it wins, and if it doesn't win, then it was fraud. And we can't persist very long as a democratic republic with that state of play.
Do you think more basic education is necessary? I mean, what is for rule of law? What does the Supreme Court do? What do we talk about when we say, there are three branches of government? Do people get this stuff? And I also want to invite our audience to please insert any questions in our Q&A box.
I mean, I do think, Celia, that the education system in practice is lacking in ensuring that every kid coming out of high school understands the things that you just said. And I don't think that there is that kind of understanding. I'm not sure it's the role of journalism, which is basically to cover the news. I'm not sure how we do that. I mean, it doesn't really make for a news story to say, here's how the Supreme Court works, I mean, maybe it can be done and maybe it should be done. But it's very outside the boundaries of how we think we're supposed to work. And so it would take this sort of vast rethinking on the fly. I mean, what would that look like? I don't know what that would look like. Is it a, you've got a story about something that's happening in real life, and then you have a sidebar that says, here's how government works, or here are the three branches of government. I don't know. It's hard to envision it in our kind of the way we do business. It's hard to envision it across any platform, whether we're watching CNN or reading a Gannett newspaper or reading the New York Times. That's kind of not what's there.
We have a question from Amy. Is there anything we as citizens can do to get the media to do a better job kind of covering this election? So let's forget about democracy and doing the democracy teaching and go back to just covering the election. I know, Margaret, that you used to take seriously as public editor at the New York Times comments that came from readers. And is that one way that citizens can get their views across? I mean, there are no public editors right now.
No, that has essentially gone away, although NPR still has an ombudswoman. But the big papers don't have that role anymore. I mean, I think that you can write letters, we can write emails to top editors. You can find out who's the national editor, who's the politics editor, who's the top editor and the managing editor of the paper, and write to them and express your views. You can write an op-ed, you can write a letter to the editor. But I think that news organizations are so used to being criticized that they have a tendency to circle the wagons and to say, I mean, you still hear people say like, well, both sides dislike us or have a problem with our coverage, so we must be doing something right, which is an absurd fallacy. But you do hear it. And I think the demise of ombudsmen and public editors has been unfortunate. It was one, I will say, when I was at the Times from 2012 to 2016, the top editors didn't necessarily agree with what I was doing or writing, but they did read it and they did pay attention to it. And it was a way, because I was internal, I was both external and internal. It was a way to break through that circle of wagons. So, but we don't have it. So, what can you do? And I guess I just go back to those. I do not think that ranting and raving on social media is a way to get any editor's attention. I think you have to do it in a more sort of traditional and formal way. And I don't know that it will be effective.
I have a something to add to that. Journalists generally try to produce journalism that their readers want. And one of the things that you can do as a reader or a viewer is to click on the stories that do something right. Click on the democracy stories, click on the stories that talk about the substance and the stakes of the election, and not so much on the stories about the latest change of 0.5% in the polls. Jay Rosen, a well-known media critic, has expressed, I'm getting it right, that the reporters should be covering not the odds but the stakes, not so much horse race, and more about what the differences are between the candidates, what they would actually do, what they stand for, and how that contextualizes within the recent history of what the government has done. And if you click on those stories, if you watch those reports on TV, if you tune in when people are doing those stories, then news media will get the signal that they're popular, that people want to read them and pay for them, by the way.
A lot of the stuff that we're discussing is also, Dan is putting in our chat box. That's where we put all our resources. And please use the Q&A box if you got a question. We have some of Margaret's columns on our resource page, which is in chat and available for download. And Margaret, you wrote that good campaign coverage should provide thoughtful framing and context. Reporters shouldn't just repeat what's being said, but help explain what it means. This is especially important in headlines and news alerts. And I wondered, are things getting better? Does your advice, make a difference? And do you think that reporters are really trying to do better here?
I think there's a marginal change that's positive. I don't know whether it is a substantial enough change to make a difference at this critical time. In general, I would say we're stuck in our old ways. And I was so interested to see the dust up about Ronna McDaniel on NBC, who was hired as a commentator. And then, to their great credit, people like Chuck Todd and others, spoke out. And there was so much disruption internally that top brass at NBC reversed the decision and basically gave her the axe. And that wasn't because she's a Republican and we don't want to hear from Republicans. It's because she lied about the 2020 election and went so far as to be, actively involved in trying to overturn it, by getting on a phone call with Donald Trump and talking to, election officials and urging them to do what they shouldn't do. But so I thought it was encouraging that these journalists inside NBC News were doing that. Good. And it changed things. But I couldn't help but notice that when top brass discussed it, they didn't seem to get the problem. They didn't seem to say, oh, perhaps we don't want someone who has a background as a election denialist and in fact almost an insurrectionist. Well, perhaps we don't want to pay for that, or even air it. Instead, they talked about, well, we seem to have a disruption on our staff and we need our staff to be aligned. I mean, it was really depressing to see that, because it showed me that they don't understand it, and also that there's this incredible urge and desire to maintain what they think is access to Republican decision makers and officials and get them on air or get scoops from them, whatever it may be. And they somehow thought that Ronna McDaniel was going to help with that, and perhaps she would have, I don't know. But somehow the larger picture, which is you don't really want to send a message that lying is rewarded here, that message was never acknowledged. And I just thought it was the whole incident was an incredible window into the way top decision makers and corporate bosses are thinking right now. And it wasn't a good it was pretty depressing.
I mean, I think it's important that NBC rejected Ronna McDaniel for the reasons you said, that she lied about the election and she actually conspired to try to appoint fake electors who would replace the electors elected by the vote of the people who voted for Biden with Trump electors. I mean, that's just fundamentally sabotage of democracy. And I think that news networks and news media generally should not be giving amplification unrebutted to lies about elections. We are not neutral. There are no two sides about who won the last election. It's over. It's counted. It's tested in court. Anyone who's still saying that the election was rigged is the same as someone coming on and trying to tell your viewers, your readers, that the sky is green and orange. It's just there's absolutely no reason to amplify that, unless to be writing about the phenomenon that they're lying about it. And then you've got to point out that it's a lie. And this comes back to the earlier question about how to cover Trump's words and Trump's rallies. There's two issues there. One is that we are trained from early in our careers as journalists to seek maximum clarity in our writing. We want meaning to be apparent. We want to resolve ambiguities. We want to be concise. And so we try desperately to search through a word salad of 800 words that Trump has said, which ranges all over multiple different subjects, to try to be able to summarize what he said about subject X. And that imposes a coherence on him that isn't there when you're giving a short soundbite or a short quote or ellipses in the quote to take out all the nonsense that was in the middle of it. So I do believe that we should be quoting him at length to show the incoherence. And I believe it's essential that we have to rebut falsehoods that he says at the same time they're said, which is why I believe you cannot take him live on the air onto a broadcast network. I think you can show as much of it as you want. You can deconstruct the whole thing if you were willing to devote 3 hours. But there's got to be, here's his quote, and here's what the fact is. And they've got to be juxtaposed, because doing a fact checker piece separately afterward just doesn't have the same sticking power.
Yeah. We have some questions from our audience. Tavon is asking, how effective has journalism fact-checking efforts been in countering misinformation during the Trump and Biden eras? Do you think we're getting pretty good at fact-checking?
So I think that Bart just said the something very important, which is that you can be as good at fact-checking as you want, or as you can build your skills to be, but if it's separated, if it's like, here's all the stuff that was said, and now we've got our fact check over here, it really loses a lot of its power. And so there's that. I mean, I think the ability to fact check is strong in many cases. A lot of news organizations have people who are really good at this. I don't know that it's being used very effectively in a lot of cases. And there's another kind of big issue here, which is that the people who are really interested in whether this statement was true, and who are reading fact checks or who are open to that kind of fact checking, this is not this is not the Fox News audience. This is not the people who've already made their decision that Trump is their guy. No, no number of, actually, that's not the case, is going to get through there. So, that's one of the things that troubles me the most about the mainstream media, is that not only does it normalize, but it doesn't, it's ignored by the people who we think ought to be watching and viewing it. Now, that's not 100% true. There are some people who, there are independents. There are people who remarkably are on the fence right now. I mean, it's hard to imagine because the choice is so stark, but that does exist. And so, what we do really matters.
Yeah, I would add that I just elaborate a little bit about my last point. We have very good fact-checking departments that have sprung up. I mean, CNN has fact-checking segments. The Washington Post has a whole column, a whole department that is devoted to nothing but fact-checking. But to make it really work, it has to be integrated into every story. I mean, every story is supposed to be about the truth, about the facts. And so you simply cannot quote a liar in his lie ever without saying it's untrue in the same story. And in fact, studies done by social psychologists show that if you actually want to affect people's understanding of the truth, if you want your fact checks to get across to the reader, you should do it in something that they call a truth sandwich, in which you first state something that's true, you report it as a fact, then you report the lie about it that it's untrue, and then you repeat the truth. And I tried that several times in my writings for The Atlantic, and I thought it actually kind of worked okay.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And the truth sandwich is kind of the best answer to this sort of thing. It is very much, I mean, you can do it in a place like The Atlantic. You could do it in other places too. But once again, we run up against our sort of practices and traditions of how we write a news story, what kind of a story will we lead the homepage with. We're very, for a business that's about the news, we're not very open to new practices. We're very stuck. And part of that being stuck, again, I firmly believe, is that it feels safe. It feels like a way to say we are not biased. And believe me, mainstream journalists are under attack all the time, particularly from the right. Oh, you're so liberal, you're in the tank for Biden, look at you again doing this. And no one wants to be that. You don't want to be called biased. You want to be seen as fair, and that's legit. So I think the impulse then is, okay, well, I'm not going to challenge the old ways. In fact, I'm going to kind of shift over to the right a little bit. But it's never enough, of course. It's not really about what's happening. It's about working the reps, and it's never, sufficient.
Further, Celia, to the question that was just asked about fact checking, I see that Wayne Dawkins in the Q&A has asked. He says, so fact checking only serves the 20% of the electorate that's not dug in, right? And I say, yeah, that's kind of true. In fact, I mean, what I worried about increasingly over the years was whether my stories in the Washington Post or my stories in the Atlantic were reaching people who had not already made up their mind. I mean, my ideal audience is an audience of people who are open to evidence and who aren't sure what's true and would like to know what's true and are interested in the evidence about it. And it was harder and harder to convince myself that I was reaching many doubters uh, in the Atlantic because they just weren't reading it. But there are independents uh, and there are undecided, and they do have a varied media diet, and they are, after all, the ones who are going to decide the election, because uh, we have less than half, but nearly half, well, certainly more than a third of the country that is dug in against Trump. We've got maybe a third of the country that's dug in for Trump, and there's people in the middle who are going to decide this election in a relatively small number of states, and so fact checking does make a difference to them.
And I think one of the things that you brought up, I think we've been really talking about the media sort of with a capital M, but there are local outlets, there are nonprofit outlets, there are college newspapers. We have 41 million Gen Zers that are eligible to vote this year. So, for example, if I'm at a local paper and I'm doing a report on a local candidate, is it fair to ask a candidate for any elective office, local, state, or federal, whether they believe Biden won the election in 2020? Should election denialism be on a reporter's checklist? That seems like a relatively simple thing to do. What do you guys think?
I mean, I'm not sure I would bring it into every story about every candidate in every time, but it makes for an interesting litmus test. I mean, as Bart said, there's no question about what happened. We know who won the election, and it's been tested, and it's been challenged, and it's been tested. It's a done deal. So if there are candidates for whatever office who are unwilling to admit that, I mean, I think it should send up a flare, and it's not a bad idea to ask them that. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say we're not going to cover you unless you answer this question the way we think it should be answered. I wouldn't do that, but I think that it doesn't have to be, a candidate for Senate or for president whose temperature we can take on that. I think it's legit.
And the other thing,
I just add that I think that question should be asked persistently of every candidate for the United States House and Senate,
Yes.
because they have a role in certifying the election, and you have an immediate litmus test of good faith in the system. If they're prepared to lie about election results and they have the power to affect election results, then readers deserve to know that. As far as lower or state officials, I think it could often be relevant, but doesn't have quite the same hook.
Nancy had an interesting question. How can librarians, media literacy practitioners, teachers, professors, and others join forces with journalists to collaborate in a more concentrated blitz to make a real difference? And Bart, along with that question, it sort of segues into your decision to work for a nonprofit, to basically leave journalism temporarily and become an advocate. So is that a good idea? I mean, is there a way that journalists can be part of a movement about truth and democracy without giving up their non-biased credentials?
Well, I mean, I suppose there are certain natural alliances here when it comes to questions of what's true, of facts, and when it comes to fundamental democratic values. They might come up, for example, in a lawsuit. You would expect that if Trump, for example, became president again and started using the power of the federal government to go after news organizations, as he has said he would do. He said he'd go after licenses of cable news television networks. That he actually doesn't seem to understand that they don't have federal licenses. Sort of network television has licenses over the airwaves. But if he were to use weaponize the power of the government to go after news media, then you would expect to have many allies who believe in the First Amendment and in the right to freedom of expression to come to their defense. I mean, journalists are wary of trying to join some broader team of teachers, professors, librarians, lawyers. I mean, they're going to be reluctant to take part in something that feels like a campaign that seems beyond the role of a journalist. But these efforts can be mutually reinforcing without being centrally directed.
And I think that's right and very smart. And I would add that one of the things that we can all do, and you don't need an organization or a campaign to do it, is to urge people whom we know not to tune out. I mean, I'm hearing this a lot from people, like, oh, it's just so argumentative and it's so distressing, and I've stopped reading the news. I don't want it anymore. I'm tuning out. I mean, I think it's not just what I think. It is a very dangerous thing, because it's what would-be authoritarians want most, is to have an electorate that has thrown its hands up and said, I can't make sense of it. I don't care about it. It's off-putting. So I think all of, librarians and media literacy practitioners and teachers and professors and journalists can, in their different ways, try to get factual information in front of people and promote the idea of staying informed. I mean, it is the most basic thing that we must do as citizens. And I don't see anything biased about it.
And we have a couple of questions that really Eileen and Sarah sort of on that same track about trying to reach people who have tuned out or who are listening to the wrong stuff, just the news on their iPhones. Or do you think it would help if the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic made their election coverage free? Paywalls are pretty steep on some of those outlets. And I think it makes even people who really do want to be more informed, it makes it harder. Thankfully, the Guardian is free. What do you think about that, about more of this kinds of valuable news that these major outlets produce?
Of course, I would love to see news made free to everyone. I want that. And I worry that, high quality news, comes at such a high price that not everybody has access to it. That really is a worry. But at the same time, we're in a media environment, a business environment, in which these news organizations, in many cases, are struggling to survive. And I mean, that's not true of cable news, but it's certainly true in the newspaper world and in the nonprofit world and nonprofit news world and others. So, a lot of news organizations did make their COVID coverage free for a time. And, it might be possible to selectively do this. I have noticed that both the Times and the Washington Post are allowing gift links to articles, or like the first time you read it, it's free. This particular article, it'll be free for a month. I mean, they're making some moves that open it up a little bit. But I think the the juxtaposition or the conflict between the business side and the pro-truth side play out in many ways, and this is one of them.
We got a question from Kendall. Do journalists consider readers with limited political knowledge when crafting their stories?
Yeah, they do. I think it may be that they assume too much, but in what we journalists call the B matter, the stuff lower down in the story, we usually try to explain the basics, or we'll do an explainer. I mean, if it becomes really important to understand in the coverage of who's running Congress, what the rules are for a vacate the chair motion, then usually there'll be a separate story that that explains that, or a diagram, that kind of thing. I think we try to make our coverage accessible to any reader who's willing to read it. But I'd be interested in other people's opinions about that, frankly, whether we're doing enough explaining.
And we have a final question. We're at the 10-minute point, so this hour has gone very fast. Monica, who is asking us from Nairobi, asks about, how do you not seem too alarmist over everything? Or maybe, I mean, I know that one of the hosts on one of the cable outlets said that scaring is caring. But what do you think? I mean, it's very hard not to be alarmed about what's going on in this election, if you believe any of the polls.
So I think that we can, I love that Bart, when he talks about all of this, talks about evidence, evidence-based reporting. We don't have to be screaming. We have to be engagingly presenting the truth based on evidence. And the headlines and the news alerts and the whatever we're calling tweets these days can all do that. It doesn't have to be. I come back to this story that blew me away over the weekend in the Guardian. That true, it was an analysis, but it really got the point across in a way that I hadn't seen so much before. Was it alarmist? It was more direct. I think we can be direct without being alarmist.
And we have a question from Peggy. As a member of Democrats abroad living in the UK, I wonder if whether the press outside the US can have more impact on the election results. Certainly, I don't know how much of your stuff the Guardian US gets to non-US residents.
Yeah, I mean, it does circulate on the website to the broader audience. So, I think that's happening. I don't know. I haven't considered that question before, whether the non-US press can make an impact. I mean, I do hear people say, well, I want to get away from this constant infighting I seem to see on American news networks, and that's why I pay attention to the BBC, that's why I read The Economist. But I think that most of those people are, they may not be the ones that would be most, susceptible to some of the lies. So they probably already kind of get it.
If I'm not misrecalling, I read recently that maybe 3% of Americans get their news from the New York Times, maybe 1% from the Washington Post, substantially, zero or as near to zero as makes no difference, get their news from foreign publications. And even though the best of the mainstream press, like the Times, reaches others because others pick up those stories and because television picks up those stories, you're still talking about a relatively small percentage, and you're still working within a system in which a huge number of Americans distrust the mainstream media, don't believe that they are reporting the truth, don't believe that they are even trying to report the truth, don't believe that they are not taking sides. And that's just, a chronic challenge that we have in maintaining our democracy, that we don't have commonly trusted news sources.
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to add one thing, which is that I like to watch when I can the half-hour evening broadcasts by ABC, NBC, and CBS, even though everyone will tell you, oh, that doesn't matter anymore. That's from another era. And there's truth to that. But it's about as mainstream as you can get. And they get, among the three of them, they get something like 25 million viewers a night. And it's a really good window into how the news is being transmitted in kind of like the most mainstream way possible. And so I have been a little encouraged, honestly, at how there's a effort to connect the dots and to present the stakes, but Bart and, quoting Jay Rosen, not the odds, but the stakes. I think I find some encouragement there.
And on this almost upbeat note, there are two questions. One question I want to ask you. You have about 30 seconds. Well, you have a little bit longer. What are the three virtues crucial to practicing ethical journalism this campaign season? And you can take a little more than 30 seconds on that. There is no prize, alas.
Three characteristics, is that the idea?
Yeah, three virtues or characteristics.
I mean, I would say, accuracy, hewing to the truth, and courage. The courage to go up against old style norms in order to serve the democracy as best as is our role. So I don't know, that's a stab at it.
Bart?
Yes, I mean, the old virtues remain. That is accuracy and fairness and neutrality in a politically partisan sense. But I think the biggest virtue that we need now, and that is sort of incompletely accepted, is a willingness to focus on the big picture stakes, and not to normalize behavior that would damage the whole fundamental system that we have used to govern ourselves.
I can't thank you enough. I hope that maybe you can come back when it's closer to the elections, and maybe things will be better, or maybe they will be worse. Thank you so much, both of you. And this webinar has been taped. The URLs for the webinar are in the chat, and it will be on our SPJ-DC website and also on our SPJ-DC YouTube channel. And thank you so much. As Caroline has put in the chat, fascinating conversation. Thank you all. And I see that our URL is in chat. And again, it's spjdc.org, so easy enough to find. But thank you very, very much for doing this. And I don't know, unless this is a very short. No, it's just a nice compliment. Adele thanks us for this discussion.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you. Thanks for having us. All right. So long.
Bye-bye.